So welcome everyone to this Government 365 webinar with Dr. Mark Bregman, talking about from compliance to creativity, how boards can balance risk and innovation. So I've opened up the chat box. So if you've got a question, I'll keep an eye on the chat. I'll just do a quick test so that you can see my test. Hopefully you'll be able to see that and add in any questions you've got there. And I'll just keep an eye on those. Before we dive in, I just want to quickly share something that might resonate with you. So one of the most common things I hear from directors and executive teams is we're pretty aligned on our strategic priorities. But then when I ask each person individually to name their top three, I often get 20 or 30 different answers. So at Government 365, we help boards, CEOs and executive teams uncover their blind spots like these. The kind that are easy to miss from the inside, but that can hold you back from growth, risk good governance, and actually cloud decision making. So our approach combines intuitive technology with real world experience. We don't tell you what to do. We help you see clearly what's working, what's not, and what good governance actually looks like in your context. So whether it's around aligning strategy, understanding enterprise risk, or lifting board performance, our goal is simple: to help you focus on what creates the most value and protect what could destroy it. So I've got with me today Dr. Mark Bregman. He's a physicist by training and a seasoned global technology executive with over 3 decades of experience driving innovation at the intersection of science, business, and policy. He's the founding general partner of Quidnet Ventures, a seed stage venture fund focused on deep tech startups in New Zealand. Mark began his career at IBM Research before moving into senior executive roles in Silicon Valley, where he led global teams in cybersecurity, enterprise software, and cloud infrastructure. Now based in Auckland, he chairs a Vistage CEO peer group and serves on several boards, helping companies navigate the tension between creative ambition and governance discipline. Mark brings a unique perspective shaped by career spanning corporate leadership, startup investment, and international science policy. His work today focuses on fostering environments where innovation can thrive within strong governance frameworks. So welcome, Mark. Fantastic to have you on the webinar.
Thanks.
Mark, you've worked across the US and New Zealand and have witnessed many boards and executive teams struggle with that balance between innovation, driving growth of the business, and governance, and particularly the compliance part of governance, protecting the organisation. So how do you, in terms of that balance, how do you perceive the relationship between innovation and governance? And secondly, can you share an instance where this balance was particularly challenging?
Absolutely. I think it's a crucial connection. I'm obviously probably more on the innovation side than most people on boards, because that's what I do for my day job. And I also see the value of innovation in driving business success as being crucial. The problem is that I think when you look at the choices of where to put your effort from an innovation point of view, you have to balance sort of the innovation and driving that with disruption to the business. If you're in an early stage business or you're a business which is still establishing itself, you can take bigger risks. But if you're in a mature business, you've got to be very careful not to chase innovation at the expense of sort of stability from the perspective of the customer base. So for leaders, whether it's the directors or CEOs or business owners, they've got to navigate that complicated balance between governance, which is often viewed as control, stability, predictability, risk reduction, and innovation, which is all about experimentation and trying things and not being afraid to try something that might not work out.
So how do you get that? How do you get that balance right? Have you got an example where you've seen an organisation really struggle with that, or have you seen, on the other side, an organisation that struggled and come out the other side and got that balance right? What's the behaviours and things that boards should be doing in that situation?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples, and these are very famous examples. If you think about Kodak, you probably don't think about Kodak anymore because it's not that important a company. But 30 years ago, probably every one of us was a customer of Kodak because we bought film when we went on holidays. its primary business was the film industry, film business and cameras. Kodak was actually the inventor of digital photography. They were the first company to produce a digital camera. But for various reasons, both within the company itself and certainly at the board level, there was a great deal of fear of the threat of digital photography to their core business, and that prevented them from proceeding. One of the things that I used to do when I was at IBM Research, I was part of a program or an effort we did every year for the senior executives that we used to call the 10-year outlook. And every year, as part of the internal team, we would produce a view of where the world was going in technology and information technology, with us or without us. It wasn't our strategy. It's what do we think is going to happen in the world of information technology, no matter what. And we mostly sought outside experts to give us insight. We then presented it to the board, and the board would every year look at it and nod and thank you very much. That's very informative. And we're taking under consideration. And then they would turn to each other and say, it's all about the mainframe, right? And so IBM, when I took over that role, I looked at 10 years of history of those presentations, and IBM research had projected every major trend, ranging from the PC to networking to client server to cloud computing to advances in you name it. We had every one of those was in a presentation which had gone to the management committee, and almost everyone had been ignored. And so my mission that first year that I was running that group from my boss was, don't worry so much about the details, just make sure it matters, make it make a difference. So that's an example. The good example, and you talked about one, where I think governance played a very important role, is more recent, and that's Microsoft. Now, I don't have a true front row seat to seeing what happened there, but a very good friend of mine who I worked with for several years, I worked initially at IBM, and then he was the CEO of Symantec, and I worked directly for him for many years. He went on to join the Microsoft board and became the chairman of the Microsoft board, and was, if not individually responsible, certainly very heavily involved in bringing Satya in as the new CEO and moving Steve Ballmer out as the prior CEO. That was driven by a very complex, in my understanding, discussion among the board as to the strategic direction of the company, somewhat of a loss of confidence in the then CEO, Steve Ballmer, in the ability to move in that new direction, and the clear need felt by the board to implement a strategic shift. That transformation was successful, I think, because there was very strong alignment among the board and between the board and the candidate, in this case, Satya, who came from inside, that enabled them to undertake a very crucial cultural and strategic shift. They moved away from the traditional, we're all about the desktop, to cloud-first strategy. And that included thinking about all the risks and the fact that if we're successful, our historic business is going to be less important. So we have to think about how to shift that. And the success also came from, I think, very careful alignment of accountability between the board and the executive team. So the board's role was really to support that bold vision while enabling and ensuring disciplined execution by the management team. John Thompson is, in my opinion, one of the best technology executives of his era. I mean, he's retired mostly now, but certainly of the early 2000 era, he was probably one of the leading technology executives in the US. He could have overstepped the bounds and said, I can fix this. I need to control this. He didn't. He had a very clear delineation between governance and execution, but he also partnered very effectively with the selected management leader, Satya, and the team. So I think that's probably the best recent example.
So that's getting the right person on board and then being very clear on the role of governance versus the role of management in terms of
well, and governance isn't just oversight and holding. I mean, in the construct of like the New Zealand IOD, we talk about holding to account. Yes, there's a role holding to account the management team, but there's also a role in helping foster the development of strategy, having an open dialogue, contributing to it. I frequently use the metaphor because of my, I guess, because of my historic background as a PhD student, of a good governance role being similar to a good advisor, like a PhD advisor. A good PhD advisor knows that their student knows more about the specific topic they're working on than anyone else. That's the definition of a PhD. You're exploring new territory. No one's been there before, including the advisor. So I, as a professor or an advisor, I would know my student knows more than me in detail, but they may have less perspective. So how can I help guide them, share my perspective, hold them to account, make sure they're on track, but not tell them what to do, not try to guide something where I don't have the experience. I'm not at the coal face. And I think that's what really operated very well in the Microsoft case and operated very poorly in the example of Kodak. There were advocates within Kodak for moving to digital, but the board was afraid to support that.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. What's the role of risk appetite? So in terms of the board and your experience, are boards having a conversation around the risk appetite? Do they understand the risk appetite around the room? Because obviously, to foster innovation, you're going to have to take risks, and the risk appetite has to be higher. So I'm interested in just digging into this. What strategies can boards employ to align their risk tolerance with their goals, their innovation goals?
I think it's not just a risk appetite. That sounds like a kind of one-dimensional measure, on the scale of 0 to 1, where are you? It's really more subtle than that. It's more nuanced than that. If you're in an existing successful company, I'm not thinking about the startups that I operate in, they can have a more one-dimensional view. But if you're in an operating business, it's got customers, it's got revenue, it's got all of those things. You can't have a one-dimensional risk appetite and say, yes, we tolerate a lot of risk, because risk applied to the main business could be fatal.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you apply your thoughts about risk to the overall business, to the experiments around changing the business, innovating within the business, you may not be able to take enough chances. One of the things that's very important is to understand that there are two different models for operations, if you will, management or even governance. There's a stage in which you're doing innovation, and that operates under the rules of science, I'll call it. And then there's the part of your business which is the operating business, the current, bread and butter business, and that operates under the rules of engineering. And I learned this early in my career when I was on the board of one of the national laboratories in the US, sort of a legacy of my science background. And we were brought together as a board for a major review by the government funding agency. And during the review, one of the scientists made the comment to the reviewing board that, well, when we undertook this effort, we didn't know if it was going to work. And the agent, the head of the agency, government agency, said, well, if we'd known that, we would not have invested. And I piped up and said, excuse me, you're from the Office of Science. Science is all about experimentation. An experiment where you get a null or a negative result, but you learn from it, that's the whole point. So expecting people to build predictably exactly what they said they were going to do, that's not science, that's engineering. At the same time that I was on this board, they were also rebuilding the Bay Bridge in the Bay Area of San Francisco, which had collapsed partially during the earthquake in 1989. And imagine if the engineering firm that rebuilt that bridge, when they cut the ribbon, the first truck went across and it collapsed into the water, said, well, it was an experiment. We didn't know it was going to work. That would be the wrong answer in that part of the business. And so it's a challenge, I think, for boards to hold these two ideas in their head. The innovation portion of the business has to be willing and able to take risk in the scope of that business or that segment, but that can't risk the whole business. And I think one of the challenges we have, maybe anticipating another question, is it's easy to get seduced by the excitement of the shiny new opportunity and have everybody focus on that. That is very dangerous.
Yeah, so you mentioned their experiments. So is that when you think about innovation, it's about doing experiments that are low cost, maybe quick, that will test your hypothesis or assumptions. So is that what boards should be looking at, as opposed to, as you say, spending, saying, I've got a high risk appetite, I'm going to put a lot of money or a lot of resource into this area and we'll see if it works or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of portfolio management. It's no different than if you're managing your own investment portfolio. You might think that this particular stock is a hot stock, but you probably shouldn't put all your money into one. You should maybe put a little bit in that stock, see how it goes. If it's doing well, maybe add a little bit more. If it's really going well, add a little bit more. But it's got to be a managed progression. And I think the key often when someone inside a business or a CEO comes to a board and they want to try something new and innovative, they obviously present it in terms of the big outcome that could result. They don't say, I want to do an experiment. They say, we can transform our business if we do this. And I think the result, or the I don't want to say pushback, but the moderation of that is to say, that's, Jerry, that's really promising. That looks really exciting. How can we validate it before we go all in? What are the first steps we can take to learn and move forward? And it's not it's not a binary decision. And sometimes it may be presented that way by management. Are you supporting me? Are you with me or against me? Are you supporting my idea to transform the business or not? And so it's a nuanced discussion to say, we absolutely support that, but we also recognize that we have a core business that we have to maintain in order to support that transition. So how can we integrate those two? There's a very well-known framework you may have heard of called the 3 horizons. If you just Google 3 horizons model, you'll find it. And it delineates within a business 3 different types of activity. There's the core business, which generates, in most businesses, the majority of the revenue and frequently more than 100% of the profit. There's Horizon 2 businesses, which are the emerging businesses. You kind of know they're coming up, they're real businesses, but they aren't yet carrying their own weight, which is why they may be a drag on profitability, but you're investing because when they get to scale, they'll be taking over the role of the Horizon 1. And then there are Horizon 3, which are really just experiments. You're not even sure they're businesses yet, but you should put some focus in that. And I think there can be a very disciplined model. It varies by industry and by company at the board level. And I'm doing this in some companies that I'm on the board of, asking them to come back and say to the board, can you explain the efforts you have in place across your work investment portfolio, your capital deployment, and how it fits supporting Horizon 1, how much supports Horizon 2, and how much supports Horizon 3. There's a lot written about this in sort of the business literature, and you can find some very interesting papers. They're a bit repetitive, but they're quite interesting because they show all the different failure mechanisms. I'm putting all my money in Horizon 3. Oh my God, that failed. My company's out of business. I'm sticking with Horizon 1. I love my core business. And then you get blindsided by a change in the market, or any misbalancing can be a failure. And I think that's a very nice framework for governance. The board's not telling the company what to do, but they're asking the company to use the mirror of the Horizon model, and it will raise the dialogue at the board level with the CE. Why is there no investment in Horizon 3? And here's the other challenge that often happens, and I've lived this both as the CEO effectively and as a board member. Because Horizon 3 businesses are experiments and they definitely don't contribute to revenue or profitability in the current period, it's very easy when under financial pressure to stop funding them. And that is an example. There are many examples where companies have, basically flown at full speed into the ground because they were putting all their money into the old business, which is being eroded by the outside market, and they failed to invest in the future. So there's a balance that's needed even when you're under financial pressure, or maybe even more so when under financial pressure.
So in the boards you've come across, US, New Zealand, do you see any differences in terms of approach or to innovation and how they balance the two? Oops, I think
I
you've just
think there
frozen.
are a couple differences. This understanding. Oh, can you hear me? Sorry,
Yeah, you just
you were
froze for a
still muted.
second. Oh, yeah.
I, I think in New Zealand there's less experience and less exposure to this kind of thinking about innovation inside of a major company or existing company. Board members typically don't necessarily have their own personal experience driving innovation. I mean, our companies are grown from the ground up, and they often are in a particular industry and they stay in that industry. There's probably also less exposure from the external market. Um, in the US, you're constantly bombarded with all of the things going on around you in the innovation world, whether they're part of your business or not, you're more aware of them. I think the other thing that's probably a little bit different is that because of the way the US market has evolved, there's much more opportunity or much more interest in collaboration, partnerships, co-investment, alignment to explore the innovation and not trying to do it all internally. I see this also even in especially in the startup ecosystem. There's a natural sort of Kiwi cultural attribute of I can do it myself, DIY. Why would I go to look to somebody else who might be a competitor to help me do this thing that I should do myself? In the US, we see much more collaboration. Co-opetition is the term we use. We're competitors, but we're going to cooperate to achieve a bigger goal for both of us. And that allows one as a business to mitigate some of the risk. If I work with another partner or a couple of partners on an innovation, I may be giving up some future opportunity a little bit, but I'm mitigating the risk significantly, and that may be a better outcome. So I think those are both things that are more limited in New Zealand, mainly because it's such a much smaller economy. You just don't have the exposure.
Yeah. What do you see as some of the barriers in New Zealand in terms of driving more innovation and getting that balance right between, existing core business and growth of, phase 2 or horizon 2 and 3?
I would say we have a lot fewer as a percentage of people in governance roles. We have a lot fewer people who have experience building innovation-driven businesses from scratch, early stage people. That's changing. We're getting more and more people getting engaged, but it's just an evolution. I think the other thing is that we have investors in the markets, and it's particularly true if you're in a New Zealand listed company. The investors in the NZX don't have the same perception of growth and innovation. They tend to be more dividend seeking rather than top line growth seeking investors, and that colors the way I think a lot of our companies behave, and including a lot of the governance leaders.
Yeah, and what about around the board where you don't have alignment, where you've got someone who wants to drive it and then you've got other directors who want to play this place safe? Have you come across any examples of boards that are misaligned and how you'd go about helping them to align to drive growth?
Well, I mean, I think that misalignment problem is on the board is true across many different dimensions, or it can be true, not just on innovation. I think when you talk about innovation and you have a disagreement like that at the board, that's where it's especially important to say, look, we need to drive innovation. Here's the opportunity it presents. We also need to protect the rest of the company from the risk of that process of innovation. And so we need to sort of sandbox, if you will, at the beginning, the innovation efforts. And when it's framed in the right way, I've been in conversations where one of the more maybe reluctant board members says, well, okay, I don't really think that's going to work, but it's not, you're scoping it as a small enough scale that I guess we can afford to do the experiments and find out before we have to bet heavily on it. I can go along with that. There's a interesting way of getting alignment, which is not looking for consensus and not voting, but actually asking people sort of a reverse question in the board and say, well, I'll use you as an example. Well, Jerry, I understand you don't really support this, but is this something that you you're not going to vote for it, but is it something that is an absolute showstopper for you? Do you have an objection if the rest of us decide to vote to proceed that is so severe that you can't live with it? You can't live with this decision. And ask for data. If they can't live with it because they don't like the color of your tie, that's not a valid answer. If they can't live with it because of a perceived risk, well, now you have something to talk about. Or maybe they're right. Maybe that's a valid point. And it turns the dialogue at the board table around a little bit. It says it's a different way of thinking about risk. You know, the risk of losing some money on an experiment isn't the same as the risk of being in violation of the law, and it isn't the same as alienating all your customers and losing the company. They're different grades of risk. And as you start to have that dialogue, you could argue that the risk of a slight decline in revenue is sort of mathematically almost the same as a risk of overspending your budget, spending too much in R&D. They both hit the bottom line in sort of the same way. So when you reframe it that way, it's often possible to get people to go along.
So you're talking about reframing to be the opportunity cost as opposed to the investment cost. Yeah,
exactly. Or put them next to each other. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So any questions from anyone, just put them in the chat. So what about the role of the chair? So where you have a divided board where you've got some safe hands, some people who don't want to take risks, and you've got some others who are, what's the role of the chair in that discussion?
Well, look, I think that the role of the chair all the time, but it especially becomes apparent under those circumstances, is to be somewhere between a coach and a referee. It's not a referee because that's not helping people develop their views. And it's not purely a coach because you can end up in a circular discussion where you just never get closure. The board is sitting at the same table, but has a little bit larger chair, so to speak. And so it's if it's too heavy-handed, just the referee role, I think it alienates the members of the board and it doesn't achieve the support that's needed for the management. Then you potentially have someone on the board who's constantly second guessing in the background. If it's too much trying to achieve consensus alone, just coaching towards consensus, you may move too slowly. So it's a balance. It's one of the reasons why we haven't replaced board chairs and board members with AIs is because it's a nuanced, complex problem. And who knows? Maybe someday AI will get there. I don't believe it, but the point is we need to take into account all these different perspectives. We each add our own experience and our own perspective into the mixture, and then the board chair is playing much the role of an orchestra conductor, not necessarily the best at any one instrument, but hopefully able to appreciate what's brought to the table by each instrument and help coordinate to get the best overall outcome. And that is that blending between, sometimes the conductor has to say, Jerry, you're too loud. That's the referee side. Sometimes the board might have to say, well, Jerry, there's something not quite right. Listen again and see what you think. Maybe there's something you need to do differently in this piece. And that's more the coach side. So it's a balance back and forth.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a question or a couple of questions here. Is New Zealand, this is from Trevor. So thanks, Trevor, for the question. Is New Zealand positioned well for organisations to support innovation, Horizon 2 and 3, due to its regulatory framework? So is there anything in the framework that's holding us back?
I don't think there's anything that I've seen in the regulatory field. I think there is, as I said, perhaps not enough attention paid to understanding the business in those horizons. I mean, I go to a lot of board meetings where we sit down every period, we review the previous period's financials, we review the next period's projected, financials. We make some decisions that are, or support and approve decisions that are relatively tactical. we very rarely, and I try to push to do more of this, look beyond the Horizon 1 operating business and look to Horizon 2 and 3. That's not a regulatory issue. It's a behavioral one at the board level, but I don't think there are regulatory barriers to doing that.
Yeah, and the second question is linked to that. So how much do you see boards balancing looking forward versus looking back? Because I've seen a lot of boards that will spend a lot of time sharing information, look at the financials. They might do the strategy refresh once a year, but in your opinion, a good board who is balancing innovation well with balancing the Horizon 2 and 3 with 1, what does a meeting look like, for them that are doing it really well versus a typical one where you're focusing on the numbers and Horizon 1?
I've definitely seen the same thing you're talking about. I have my own idealized view of how a board meeting should run. To be honest, I haven't realized that yet in New Zealand or in the US. I've gotten much closer in the US, but I've also spent more time at it because I've been doing that longer. In an ideal case, all of the historic data should be in the board package in a form that's easily digestible. I don't seeing, 10 spreadsheets showing every business unit, detailed financials. That's good backup material. I don't want to read it. And I'm not even an accountant. I don't think I could see that much. I want the perspective from management of how was the last period? What should we learn from it? What did we do well? What did we not do well? What are we going to aim to do better? And then I want to move to the near term future period. And that becomes more of a discussion of, well, based on how we did, here's how we see the next period, and that might be a quarter, might be a year, but it's not a 5-year view. And then in the discussion about strategy, which may not be in every meeting, although there may be checkpoints against it, I think it's very valuable on at least an annual basis to step out of I won't say governance role, out of the financial review role and oversight role, and have an open discussion about strategy. Now, I've seen strategy reviews where basically the company comes in and shows you their product roadmap for the next 3 or 4 years. They tell you how they see the market developing. All of that is good data. But having a presentation without the opportunity to dig in and have the dialogue is not actually as a board member, you can't add any value. So I think we've got to think about, this is a funny way to say it, but I'm at a sort of an AI conference, so I'll use this example. In the AI world, there are two very different things, and we often don't think about them separately. There is the building of the large language model, the learning, feeding all the data in, digesting it, and now you've got an understanding in the large language model. And then there's the use, which is what most of us do, which is we use the large language model to look out into the future, to basically make a prediction, whether that's helping us predict the next word and make a sentence or some forecast. I think boards spend too much of their time is at the board level, building the language model. That's something that ought to be prepared in the board package and in the education part of a board meeting by management. Now, there's some dimensions of that where you want to get an outside view. So I'm a big advocate of having boards bring in an outside person, organization, what have you, periodically to say, give us your view of how the market we play in is evolving over the next 3 to 5 years. And it's not to say we don't trust management. It's more to say we want to get educated with an external view. Similarly, if there are technical issues, if it's a technology business, which is mostly the ones I'm involved in, sometimes you want an external view of where do you see the technology going. And hopefully it's aligned. If it's not, it raises the right questions that ought to be asked by the board. We're not telling you to do something different. Oh, I'll use you as an example again and say, Jerry, you showed us your roadmap, and we just heard from this, futurist that it's different. What's the reason? You may have a fantastic reason, and we'll support it, but we need to have that's the discussion that needs to take place, not a rubber stamp of what you've done or saying without any context from an outside view.
Yeah. So that getting the culture right in the board and in the organisation in terms of a culture where you're balancing experimentation with managing Horizon One. Where does that come from? So is that coming from the leadership team and the CEO, or should that be influenced by the board and the chair, or is it a combination?
It's definitely a combination. I mean, the example I gave you of Microsoft, I think, and this is just hypothetical, but I think if John Thompson had been, I don't know, a bank executive his whole career and was chairman of the Microsoft board, I don't think he could have aligned with Satya on the complex strategic business direction because he wouldn't understand the core of that business. But John came from a 30+ year career in technology. In some cases, Microsoft was his biggest competitor when he was running his businesses. In some cases, it was his most important partner. But he had a perspective, not from inside Microsoft, but from the marketplace, of the technology, of what is possible. John has a phrase he used to use all the time when I worked for him. He wanted us to explore the art of the possible. And that meant, I want you to, as an executive, I want you to come back to me as the CEO and tell me the art of the possible. I don't want you to tell me what you can do with your current budget. We can have that discussion. But right now, I want to know what's the art of the possible.
Right.
And we also have to support that with, for that to be true, what do I need to believe? And that's the external factors. Well, you need to believe that there's going to be a computer in everyone's house. Well, that's a pretty important belief. Now, do I believe that? If that's the basis of my business plan and it doesn't turn out to be true, that's a big problem. So this is sort of the dialogue that happens hopefully inside the company and also between the CE and the board and the management and the board.
Yeah. Okay. Got a question here. Is it possible for you to comment on how management can navigate the differing risk appetite and governance priorities of independent directors versus shareholder directors?
That is a very interesting and somewhat fraught question. I'll give you the example of my own experience being in venture-funded company, joining their board prior to the IPO of the company, and then being on the board through the IPO until after. Venture investors are shareholders and often are directors on the boards. And particularly in the US, I'm going to overstate this a little bit, and you can see my cynicism about US venture, which is, by the way, why I'm in New Zealand and not doing what I do in the US. They very often are basically saying to themselves, look, I've got a portfolio of investments as a venture capitalist. And what I really care is that out of these 10 companies I've invested in that I'm on the board of, and they often are on the board of 10, one of them has to be really successful. So what does that mean? They have a extremely high risk appetite, because if 9 of them fail completely, they don't care. That's not their problem, as long as one of them is successful in a big way. So they will push companies that they're on the board of at the board table to do things which are essentially high risk, high reward, let me say. They won't do things that are high risk, low reward, but they'll do things that are high risk, high reward. Wow, if we try that and it works, we'll be $1 billion company. It's fantastic. What if it fails? Well, yeah, then I have another one in my portfolio. The other board directors, because there are other shareholders, have to look out for all the shareholders and have to take a slightly different view. And that does sometimes put them at odds. And it's not infrequent in that case, and even in other companies, that you have to remind the other directors, the ones who are themselves representing a single large shareholding or a block, that their job as directors, and I love the language that's in the New Zealand Companies Act, because it's a little more explicit, is that your job is to act in the best interests of the company. That indicates all the constituents. Now, they're not all equal. I'm not going to act on behalf of, I don't know, the local community at the expense of the employees and the shareholders if there's a trade-off, but I have to take it into account. In the US, it's a little bit different. Historically, the focus has been entirely on shareholders. And so a large shareholder can say, I am acting in the best interest of shareholders, me. That's not quite the same as all shareholders. And so I do think that's something we need to bear in mind. And it, as I said, it comes up on boards in New Zealand I've been on boards where this comes up, whether they're pre-public or public, as a dialogue quite frequently. I don't know. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and just in terms of diversity and people you want around the board, New Zealand's got it. Oh, not just New Zealand. When people look at board makeup and the simple matrix that a lot of boards use, which is like your experience and your male, female, and it doesn't sort of look at your diversity of thinking. What's your view in terms of having a company that can balance innovation with core? How should they be looking at what do I need around the table? What's the good practices that you've seen?
Well, I think that the normal focus, as you pointed out, there's lots of people looking at board diversity for good reason. They look at the obvious metrics because it's easy to measure. How many white males are on the board versus other diversity. That's an easy measure. I just have to look at it. Looking at diversity of thought is much harder. I've been involved in boards where we've gone through the exercise of creating that sort of board. We usually call it a skills matrix, but it's not just skills in the sense of dexterity or whatever skill implies. It's also, as you said, point of view and experience and context. And so, boards, especially when companies are in a situation where they have to transform their business, need to lean more into bringing in onto their board people with perspective, experience, context that's different than the current business of the company. One of the challenges is it's relatively easy for boards to fall into the trap of, as board changes take place, bringing in, so-and-so's leaving the board. How do we replace them with the next board member? And in many cases, the right answer is not how do we replace them. It's, and I'll say this a little bit sarcastically, thank God Jerry left the board and retired because we actually need a different skill set. He was fantastic to get us where we are, but he's not the skill set we need to get us where we need to go. And so thinking very much about where do we need to go, what do we need on the board to bring that different set of skills and experiences is crucial. And I think I see this question is that, directors versus advisors. I think it's important that you have that variety in the directors, not only bringing in advisors. Advisors can be very helpful, but if the directors are all of one, groupthink, the advisors' information and advice may not land. You need to have an ideal board needs to have some. There's a term in French, frisson, which is like friction. There needs to be some tension, not fighting each other, but there needs to be a little bit of, countervailing views to stimulate the dialogue and make sure you're exploring the whole space. And if you get a board which is fully aligned, you're probably not doing justice to the shareholders or the company.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And last question, I was going to talk about what emerging trends should boards be aware of to stay ahead in fostering innovation while maintaining strong governance on the horizon one. What trends do you see?
I think. Well, I'll talk about a major, high level one, and I'll get more specific. The highest level one is, if you're not familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, you hopefully are, but if you're not, Google it. Gartner is an advisory firm in the ICT space, but they've created this model years ago, and they've basically, now they use it for everything, and they review different technology trends, and they put them all on these hype cycles. So right now, I just came from a meeting here about AI, and the speaker was clearly at the absolute peak of the hype cycle around AI. And what we know from history is new ideas, new technologies, new innovations go through that hype cycle. They start out, people think they're a bit crazy. They rise up the hype cycle. All of a sudden it's, oh my God, the answer to everything is this technology. It's going to solve the world's problems. And then we learn more about it, and it goes down into the trough of disillusionment, where you say, oh man, it's not, that was the last idiot idea. It's never going to be true. But what's very interesting and important to understand as a board member is that almost every technology in some form ends up coming out of the trough of disillusionment into this sort of slower growth, upward sloping curve, which is where all of the impact and money is made and businesses are built and everything else. Classic example, if you looked at the internet bubble in the late 1990s, there you go. You would have seen in 1997, 98, if you added .com to the name of your company, my company is garbagecollection.com, you could get money. And people thought it was brilliant. The fact that you're using a donkey cart to collect people's garbage didn't matter to them. It said .com at the end, you were riding the hype. And that's kind of where we are with AI. We will, and we're starting to see a bit of a trough of disillusionment. And in 99, that happened. It was the .com bubble burst. And all these things like pets.com and all these companies that were not really there went away. Now, pets.com, selling things on the internet wasn't a bad idea, but it was overdone. It was too much. And there was a guy who we all know who stuck with it through the trough of disillusionment, worked hard, grew up the slope of enlightenment, and now rides the plateau of productivity. Jeff Bezos at Amazon.com. I mean, he was one of those .coms. He was the one who didn't get too overinflated by the peak of expectations and stuck with it and understood how to balance what was Horizon 3 and what was Horizon 2 and what was Horizon 1. Horizon 1, people buy books. Hard to find the book you want? I can sell that. It's easy to ship. I'll start with books. I'm going to sell books on the internet, not dog food, not fashion wear, whatever. But he's built it to a massive business and worked his way through. At some point, Amazon Web Services, which is a massive business in its own right, was merely a Horizon 3 experiment within that company. If he had moved everything and he said, we're giving up on books, we're going to stop the store, we're going to do everything, just become a data center company, maybe it would have failed and he'd be unemployed. He didn't do that. He balanced it. So I think that's a very key aspect of it. Having said that, I would say every one of these things that gets to a peak of the hype peak almost always follows this curve. And the real question one has to ask is, how big is that slope of enlightenment and the long-term value going to be? Mm-hmm. A good example, I would say, I'm a bit of a crypto skeptic, but let me be even more skeptical about NFTs. You know, what was it, 3 years ago? People would say, oh, everything can be NFTs. You have to attach an NFT to your laundry and it's going to be incredible and it's going to be, okay, we're past that. We're probably in the trough of disillusionment where now nobody even talks about it. There are people in businesses saying, you know, here's a use case where it actually makes sense. I'll give you an example. And I know some people doing businesses like this, and maybe some of the chains are doing this. Hotel reservations. If I book a room in a hotel, that hotel knows that I'm going to take that room on that date. But as it works today, if my plans change, the only choice I have is to cancel it. I can't transfer it. I can't say, I mean, I can do it inefficiently. I can tell my friend Jerry, oh, you're going to the conference, I'm not, why don't you use my reservation? That doesn't work very well. But if you use an NFT, which is an authentic indication that I hold that reservation, I could sell it to anybody. And they would have to trust me that as soon as they have that NFT, they have the actual reservation. Same thing with concert tickets, anything like that, airline tickets. That could revolutionize that industry. It's going to take years. But if you're not thinking about it, if you're a hotel company, you're not thinking about it, and your competitor does it, and suddenly they've got 90% occupancy every week, and you're going up and down depending what's happening with the weather, flight cancellations, whatever, who's going to win? There's an example where I actually, a year ago, before I saw this version of it, I would have said, oh, NFTs, that was idiotic. That was just a flash in the pan. That wasn't real. Like everything else, it's coming up the other side. Is it going to transform the whole world? Not the way they thought, and probably not, but it's going to have an impact. So thinking about technologies in light of that, and especially for your companies, when the peak of hype is there, there will be people in the company saying, oh my God, we've got to go all in. We've got to fire all our employees that are in the accounting department. We're going to do it all with AI. Probably not. Are you going to never use AI for accounting? Probably not. Let's find the rational path. Where can we experiment? accounts receivable, maybe that's a place to experiment. What if it doesn't work that well? Well, our account will know it because our accounts receivable will go out a few more days and we'll be able to moderate it and see what's happening. Doing it to be a customer facing interface, maybe not. If it doesn't work, I lose a customer. So that's what I mean by thinking about it rationally in terms of experiments and still doing innovation, but don't innovate everything at once.
Yeah,
it's not a binary, do it or don't do it. Are we going with AI or not going with AI? Neither one of those is the right answer.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. So just going through, some great examples around Kodak versus Microsoft. I think the other one, people talk about risk appetite, but it's, as you said, unless you're a startup, you're going to have various risk appetites in parts of your business. So, and you can't be a binary high risk appetite or low risk appetite. So it's got to be relevant. And I really like the 3 horizon model. So, think about our core as feeding the business at the moment, the emerging, and then the experiments that you're going to do over time. I think the other part is collaboration, which less happens here than the US, but where are the areas of cooperation or co-opetition, as you talked about? I think that's another area for people to look at. The alignment at the board and the executive team, you talked about that right at the start, is important, but having the friction. So actually having alignment, and where you have barriers, it's really drilling into understand, can people live with it? So, having those experiments and making sure that you're having those conversations. And I like the idea of the chair being somewhere between a coach and a referee. So in terms of making sure that they're looking at the short and the long term, and making sure that there is that friction going on. So they were some of the key things. So I really enjoyed the conversation, but I think it's not an either or, but I think for people, it's where are you experimenting within your business, and if you're not experimenting within your business, then you're going to be declining in the future. So that's the key take out for me. So thank you, Mark, for your time and expertise. We've shared quite a few things that I think have struck a chord. And if you're wondering whether some blind spots might be holding you back in your team, feel free to reach out to me after the session. I'm always happy to have a quick chat to explore what's going on in your organisation, whether Govern 365 might be able to help. You'll know pretty quickly if it's worth continuing the conversation, I guarantee. Our next webinar will be with Carol Pedder, who's the owner of PKF With a Sang, where we'll dig into owner succession planning and getting the most value for your business. So thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate your expertise, and look forward to catching up with you next time.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.